So please join me in welcoming Matt Ryder.
Good morning. Thank you. I just want to make sure that everyone could either hear me or see me. Is that possible? Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be with you guys today, and I guess I need to be careful about where I stand so that you can see my illustrious PowerPoint presentation, which I spent so much time on. Woo, woo, woo. So let me tell you a little bit about myself, give you an overview of what we're going to do today, and then jump right in because we got lots to cover. As you can see, you got a nice thick packet there for PowerPoint presentations. So as Sherry said, I used to work for the Clare Center at Gallaudet University. My whole tenure at Gallaudet was probably about 2 years. I spent 8 years in various roles, initially as the Director of Mental Health Services for the Clare Center, supervising counselors, social workers, and psychologists. And then kind of moved around into other different positions, clinical positions, and then eventually into their training and professional development office, where my goal was to develop mental health related workshops for people who work with deaf kids, and then travel around the country and present these at different places. So it was really cool. I loved it. It gave me the opportunity to use both of my skill sets, being able to present well, which I love to do, being able to train, meet people, and then gathering public input from everyone from teachers, administrators, all the way down to parents who work with kids. Some states, I don't know if you know this or not, have family learning vacations. Are you familiar with those? No? So various states have events, sometimes they're called different, like family weekends or family week or whatever, but families who have deaf children will come together once a year at a centralized location in the state, and they'll have a weekend or sometimes a whole week's worth of activities that involve training and bonding for kids. This is especially important in big states or rural states where kids who are deaf tend to be pretty isolated. So it was really nice to be able to attend a lot of those family learning vacations and get to know what the issues are for parents and to help connect them with various resources. So enough about me. Let's talk about what we're going to do today. So today is going to be a little fast-paced. Some of this stuff may ring very true to you. Some of this may be a little counterintuitive. I've incorporated a lot of activities because I don't know about you, but I really hate to sit 4 or 5 hours and just let somebody drone on and on and on. I have much better things to do, like the crossword puzzle or a Sudoku puzzle or something. So I'm going to keep you guys active. If I start seeing heads kind of dropping and drool start puddling on the table, then I realize it's probably time for a break, okay? I'm going to encourage you to step outside of your comfort zones today, because some things that I have going on today, I'm going to need volunteers. So the volunteer thing is pretty easy. I give you a scenario, or you create a scenario, and then you'll role play it out in front. So is there anybody interested? Can I get maybe 5 or 6 people who would be interested in kind of jumping in and being role plays? Well, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Can we do 2 more? 2 more? All right. All right, great, fantastic. So I may call on you at any given moment and thrust you into, no, I'll give you preparation time. So today's workshop is called Going with Resistance, a creative approach or creatively avoiding power struggles. And how many of you have had to work with either kids or adults who are incredibly resistant? Oh, come on, tell the truth. So I think it's very frustrating to work with very difficult kids or adults, or even, okay, I'm going to ask this. Are any spouses in the room, by the way? How many of you have a resistant spouse? Yeah, okay. So some light bulbs are going to go off for you today. As we go through today's presentation, you're going to start thinking not only about that kid that's on your mind that's really been bugging you, but also maybe someone in your family or someone close to you that's really been struggling and you've been struggling in relationship with. Maybe you notice that you argue unfairly with the person and you have the same arguments over and over and over again. So hopefully you'll take a lot more than what's just up on the slides here home with you today. So our agenda today, we're going to do a brief overview about resistant behaviors, and we're going to try to look at the difference between resistant behaviors that are rooted in some basic need versus other resistant behaviors. We're We're going to look at different multiple perspectives from a psychological point of view that could be causing these types of behaviors. I'm going to have you guys do a little self-analysis, okay? Unfortunately, I didn't bring 75 couches with me, so you guys are going to have to do it in your seats. And then we're going to talk about what the power struggle is and what's involved in it and why it happens and how to know when you've actually stepped in it and you're stuck in one. Rules of fair fighting, or fighting fairly, I think I put it there. I think when I said rules of fair fighting, I thought people were getting out the gloves and okay, let's duke it out. But it's arguing fairly. And then lastly, some paradoxical approaches that I think really have been successful for me over the years in working with kids. Now, I've been at this for well over 20 years. I've worked in a variety of different settings, everything from therapeutic foster care to residential treatment centers, inpatient, outpatient, private practice, and currently I have my own private practice in Silver Spring and in another location in Maryland, where I see about half of my caseload is deaf and young kids as well as adults. And then I also work part-time at the Baltimore City Jail. And so I get really resistant people, and I've learned I've learned how to kind of go with resistance. I was exposed to this approach a number of years ago, thought it was really cool, so I did a lot of research on it and started implementing this over the years. And I have to tell you, it's strange and it goes against everything that you've ever been taught about behavior planning, but it works, and I'll explain why later. Okay, so I'd like you to think a few moments about what you would like to get from today's presentation. So would anybody be willing to offer up something that you came here with a burning desire to learn? Blank slates, yes?
How to avoid getting in a power struggle instead of stepping in, how to avoid it altogether.
Perfect. So how to know that it's coming and act proactively so that you don't end up in one, right? Super. Others? Yes?
I'm a school social worker and I have kids who just have no problems and I don't want to be there.
So you have perfect children who happen to be stuck in some strange behavioral program. Why in the world do they need that? So hoping to be able to give insight so that they can start owning some of their behaviors, what you're looking for, right? Fantastic. Others? Yes?
How to prepare them for the future. How you do the hormone deficiency or preventing their job to be successful in adulthood.
So in regards to not just resolving the immediate struggle, but teaching them skills on how they can then go out and resolve struggles on their own without you being present. Fantastic. We can do that. Anything else? Yes?
It might be nice to learn how to sort of model in the moment. So if you're in the hallway and there's an interaction, if there's an aide or a teacher or another staff person there, to be able to kind of model an anti-power struggle confrontational sort of approach and then have that carry over into other settings would be nice.
Fantastic. When we finish today, and if you start to implement these techniques and this frame of reference, it'll become second hand for you, or second nature for you, and you'll just automatically start thinking in those terms, and you'll be able to recognize when you're about to step into a power struggle and start modeling that for other people. Or if two people are arguing, you can then act as a mediator in that using these techniques. Anything else? Yes?
What are some of the subtle signals that you may be moving into a power struggle situation? I can recognize it when I'm in the middle of it, but it's like, why didn't I see this coming?
Right.
And I think sometimes it's subtle, but it's real in terms of cues that this is where we're headed.
So we're going to touch on that very, very clearly. Thank you. So it's important to recognize when your buttons are being pushed, right? And then you find yourself needing to win an argument. And yes, we'll definitely cover that. Yes?
The different types of power struggles. We have some students who turn in statues, and some students who throw themselves on the floor, and how to kind of work our way through all the different types.
Okay, so when we get to the power struggle piece of this, please remind me about that, okay? Because we'll see how we'll throw this up against our model and see what we get, okay? Anything else? Okay, well, if you want to jot down notes as to what you'd like to learn, please feel free to. Okay, so at the end of the day, you may have this great moment, but when you got an issue with somebody who just won't play by the rules, it's that one kid that you take home with you in your head, and it stays with you and eats at you, and then the next confrontation, you're always waiting for that next confrontation. And you feel like, oh my gosh, can I actually ever be effective with this kid? Well, yeah, you can. And you can even let him split the water if he wants to. Okay, so I'd like you to think about who your problem student is. I'm going to give you a minute to kind of think about the one student or adult or person in your family, because this applies to everybody, who you have the biggest issue with, okay? I want you to think about who the person is, what is it that they do that gets on your last nerve, where they tend to do it, and when they tend to do it. So under what circumstances? Do they do it when other people are around and they have an audience? Or do they do it just in general? Do they do it whenever you ask them to do something? Or is it a last minute kind of thing? If you ask them last minute, they don't adapt well to transition. What is it? So take a few moments and write down your problem kid. Please don't put full names. We want confidentiality secured here. You'll notice that I didn't put why, because we're going to deal with the why later. I'm going to give you a minute to just process that. I want to ask you, are all behavior problems actual acts of resistance? No? Can you give me an example of something that's a behavior problem that's not really an act of resistance? Anybody? Yes? Simple misunderstanding, sure. They misunderstood what was happening and they got irritated and decided to plant their feet and they're not backing down, right? It's possible. So, yes?
Oh, I was just going to say another one.
I'm sorry?
I was just going to say another one. Like
Please.
Fear.
Fear. Yeah, sometimes we act in fear and we won't move forward. That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. I had not thought of that. I'm supposed to be the expert. I hadn't thought of that. Thank you. So, some issues are some behavior problems are simply developmentally appropriate or situationally appropriate in the case of fear, and some are actual acts of resistance, okay? So, let's talk about tantrums. Are they developmentally appropriate? If so, raise your hand, if you believe so. It depends upon the age. I get that every time. You're right, depends upon the age. Okay, what about acts of resistance? Again, depends upon the age. Cop-outs, come on. Okay, let's see here. Actually, tantrums are pretty developmentally appropriate across the board. When you think of what's going on developmentally for someone who's tantruming, especially in the younger ages, this happens a lot where they lack that prefrontal cortex, of course, but they also lack full, complete lexicon and language. And so when you can't communicate with somebody, it gets very irritated. You get very irritated and very angry. I remember when I started working at Gallaudet, I had been out of deafness for about 5 years. And so I lost a lot of my receptive skill. So when they started me back at the Clare Center, they didn't provide an interpreter, and I was sitting in workshops like this with about 75 people, all deaf, and it was just boop, 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 sign, which I thought was really kind of cool, but I couldn't understand a word of it. And I thought, I'm going to fail in this job. And I got more and more anxious, and I have a deep core need to be competent and viewed incompetent. And I was an administrator, for God's sakes. So I was getting more and more angry, and I found myself getting angry because I couldn't understand it. And so I would take it home, and I'd blast my roommates at the time, which wasn't very fun. But when you don't understand what's going on, or you can't communicate what's going on, and face it, we speak different languages than kids. Even if it's still English or sign, we speak different languages. We have different codes, we have different influences, and that breakdown in communication can often lead to tantruming. What about sex play? How many think it's developmentally appropriate? How many think it's an act of resistance? Boy, how many don't know?
What do you define that as?
Experimental sex. Developmentally appropriate, right? Yeah, developmentally appropriate. Kids have different equipment. They're curious about it. They want to see how it works. I can't tell you the number of parents or school people who've come to me and said, oh my God, they were touching each other. He must have been molested. No, chances are he's not, okay? It's just developmentally appropriate. My own son, I've got 2 kids. I have an 8-year-old and a 3.5-year-old. And my 3.5-year-old, for whatever reason, I don't know, has this fetish about nipples. It's the strangest thing. And so he connects with that skin-to-skin contact. You know how kids will bond that way. And so he connects by putting his hand down my shirt and just placing his hand on my nipples. And I'm like, Kieran, please, don't do that. That's awkward, please. But at the same time, I understand that that's just his connection. It's not sex play for him, and I don't know where he got it. I imagine that the nanny, who had a baby at the same time that he was born, and she probably breastfed him, he probably got that from her. He didn't get it from me. Experimental drug use. Developmentally normal. Active resistance. Okay, we have a lot of non-committal folks here. I'm going to put it in developmentally normal because I said experimental. Okay, if we were talking chronic or repeated, then I would definitely put it in active resistance. Because once you know something's bad for you, you test that and you realize, yes, it's bad for me and I could get in trouble for it, and you can continue to do it later. It becomes more about a willpower issue and than it is about just being developmentally normal. Promiscuity. Developmentally normal. Active resistance. How many of you are cheating from the PowerPoint? Okay, I call this an active resistance because, again, once you know something is potentially dangerous for you and you do it anyways and you could get consequences for it, you can get STDs, you can get pregnant, everyone around you is telling you not to do it, and you do it over and over and over again, it becomes more about control. Let's see here. What about repeated fighting? Developmentally appropriate? Active resistance. You guys are getting good at this. Repeated fighting, active resistance. Okay? Again, if there are negative consequences for it and you continue to do it, chances are it is an active resistance. This is in general. Now, we all have those situations where a kid is repeatedly fighting because something bad is going on at home, where he's being bullied or something of that nature. So this isn't a gold standard, boom, every time you've got someone who's getting into fights over and over again, that's an act of resistance. But in general, if there aren't any other mitigating circumstances, it's safe to say that this is probably an act of resistance. The bottom line is it all comes down to motive. So if the motive is for autonomy and self-control and being able to call the shots yourself, chances are it's an act of resistance. So what are some causes or perspectives on oppositional behavior? So I've broken this out, and you guys are going to break out into little groups here. I've broken this down into various perspectives. So we have the cognitive side, which would be intellectual, right? Pretty easy, thinking. The emotional side, or psychological, what's going on with a person psychologically. Developmental, something that we expect a kid to go through. Interpersonal, so this would be social stuff that could be going on in the kid's interpersonal life. And then physiological, so medical, biological. So I'd like you to partner up with somebody, or maybe you can go in triads, quads, whatever you want to, and pick one of these perspectives and come up with a list of different approaches. So if I'm coming from the physiological, the medical perspective, I could say that somebody has bipolar disorder. And so we're talking not just acts of resistance, but all types of behavior, oppositional behavior. So I could say somebody has schizophrenia and they tend to act out aggressively. They could have some type of a brain trauma which causes them to act out aggressively. And so then I want you to think about what perspectives somebody from that perspective would do to approach behavior. So I'm going to give you guys about 5 minutes, maybe 6 minutes to work on that. Okay, so pick one of the topics, come up with how they view the behavior and what type of interventions they use. I just wanted to show you a little app, by the way. I use this app a lot with with my sessions because it helps me stay on target, but it really works well, especially with visually oriented kids, which a lot of deaf kids are. It's an egg timer. And it's a free little egg timer app that you can buy at the App Store or get at the App Store. But you set whatever time that you want, and they can watch the grains of sand fall. And so that as your time is getting lower and lower and lower and lower, then it works and it's kind of cool. So I use it here, and I thought it was going to make this nice little funny noise, but it didn't. It's called Smart Egg Timer or something of that nature. If you do a search in the App Store, you should be able to come across it. It's the free one. They do an advanced one. The free one works just as well. Okay, so you had a lively discussion. I saw many of you guys working very diligently. Would anybody like to tackle cognitive? Don't make me call on you, please. Yes, please.
You were just talking about how kids kind of shut down when they feel like they don't know the right answer, or they just completely don't answer or say, I don't know, without even trying.
That's a good point.
We just talked about how it's really good to reassure them that it's okay to get something wrong and make mistakes, and kind of even point out when we make mistakes ourselves and it's okay, but it's better to try than not try at all.
Fantastic. So when kids are lacking the cognitive skills, whatever that skill set is, whether it's math, algebra, for me it's algebra, whenever you're lacking that, then they can freeze and just dig in and be embarrassed and possibly work that out in some type of acting out behavior, right? And so then normalizing that for the kid and helping them take it one step at a time would be a great approach to dealing with that behavior, right? And what are the advantages of that?
Just to, I don't know, boost their confidence.
Sure, it boosts their confidence, right? It's something logical, and it gets them to start engaging the rational brain as opposed to the emotional brain. Fantastic. Okay. Who would, anyone want to add to that? Yep.
So the cognitive piece, we sort of discussed sometimes how directions are too complicated and you get oppositional behavior because with those intellectual deficits, directions sometimes can be too complex, which increases non-compliance or the oppositional stuff. So maybe one of the strategies or some of the strategies would be to simplify, clarify, the directions being broken down in smaller.
Absolutely. So if it's too much, they just get overwhelmed with all the steps, especially if you're dealing with somebody with a learning disability. Then it becomes overwhelming and they don't hear it. Or someone with ADHD possibly, where the moment that you get the first part of that instruction, they're already on to something else and are no longer paying attention, and then again getting embarrassed or getting frustrated. So helping them through that into small little digestible sections would be very helpful. Okay? And the advantages of that?
Doing that?
Yeah.
To increase to curb some of the opposition behavior.
Right. Well, so how do you eat an elephant, right? One bite at a time. You don't sit down and swallow the whole elephant. You eat an elephant one bite at a time. And same thing with big directions. So that really plays into the cognitive piece of it. Great. Anything else about cognitive before we move on? Yes?
I was thinking more of like theoretical approach, like cognitive behavior therapy, where you actually go through the process step by step and you teach them the step by step to prevent, frustration or whatever.
Fantastic. So developing insight then into that think, feel, do trilogy there, that model where what you think affects how you feel about it, and that affects what you do. Great. And there's tons of advantages to CBT, as we know, that it's been studied over and over and over again. So again, it's developing insight, and as you start developing neural pathways for different ways of responding to situations that are the same type of a situation, then those neural pathways then become more solidified and it becomes easier and easier. Great. Thank you. Okay, emotional. Anyone want to tell us what you guys come up with emotional? Yes?
Sure. We said that there's a lot of different factors that can contribute to the emotional part, like the cognitive, the psychological, developmental. A lot of it is language even too. Some of it that can also add to that is like problems at home, problems at school. Those social skills or lack of social skills, and not having the language to express themselves. Some different interventions that we listed would be CBT, working with the school social worker, role playing, social stories, and medication. The advantages of role playing we listed are being able to see it modeled for you, but also exploring different answers and why the answer would be a positive or a negative, and building on the language and that, how to communicate it more efficiently. Social stories, having it modeled for them, being able to look back at that, seeing it visually over and over again. Kind of medication would be as a last resort, and negatives would that be side effects and being dependent on it and not being able to build more social skills from it or language to express themselves more freely.
Fantastic. It's very comprehensive. You just wrote like a behavior plan. That's awesome. I guess psychologist, maybe?
Well, deaf educator, my background is
Okay.
counseling too.
Fantastic. Okay. So very comprehensive model then, looking at the emotional piece of it and see what's going on there, and then coming from a holistic approach to it. So it's not just doing talk therapy, which has its benefits, but not every kid can do talk therapy. Other techniques such as sand tray therapy or play therapy with kids can be a lot more effective, or with adults even. I remember I had suffered a death in my family, and when I came back to work, my team of counselors and social workers pulled out the sand tray, and I couldn't even express to them the level of grief that I had. And so I put together a sand tray, and it was incredibly therapeutic. It was great. And because I wasn't able to get back into my job until I was able to like purge that stuff. So it's a beautiful approach. Thanks. Anything else from the emotional perspective? Yes.
We just picked one, like if a kid had a loss in their family and how you could kind of approach that. So we said if they were talking to a social worker about that, and we talked about the pros and cons. The pros that they could connect with another person and start to like decompress and get some of those emotions out, but the cons would be if they didn't know that person and just the additional maybe angst that would cause them in talking to that person, or maybe they didn't want to talk about it. So
Sure. That would especially be true with abuse, right? If there's abuse going on and they're ashamed or afraid, they would start shutting down. Another con that I'd like to throw out on the table is people who are not from a mental health perspective and don't have any thought of that tend to treat every problem as if it's emotional, right? So they send every behavior problem kid to the counselor, fix it, fix it, fix it. So that would be a con because then it's not really addressing the actual issue. Okay, developmental? Anybody jump on developmental? Yes?
Yeah, we kind of did a perspective. We take like kids who might get out of their seat or alert. You have carpet time where you're supposed to be sitting and doing a group. And some of the treatments that we talked about were like a punitive, some type of punishment, redirection, ignoring, using a visual cue, or adaptive equipment like some chairs or balls to sit on. Advantages were for punitive or some type of punishment, it's immediate. But a disadvantage is for self-esteem, it doesn't really actually work. For redirection, we said it models it appropriately, but it can take a lot of time. Ignoring, we said, it may reduce those attention-seeking behaviors, but if it, at the same time, it could be disruptive and inconsistent. Visuals,
For visual cue, you said like it would be constant or clear if it was like a circle time and you sit on this blue circle or you sit on the letter J, that would be something that would be permanent, so it would always be there, it would always be the same. But some disadvantages would be that if it was only Joe had to sit on a particular dot, that it could really single him out. The adaptive equipment was similar, it would be consistent, it would be clear, but again, if it was just one particular student, it would single them out. And it would also be kind of low flexibility. If suddenly Mary wanted to sit on the blue dot, we could have issues.
Those are all excellent points. And So a lot of these developmental approaches are really dealing with the behavior in itself, and you have to repeat it over and over and over. So, which is true for a lot of plans, consistency is the key to success, right? If something goes wrong with it, or you're dealing with 2 or 3, God forbid, or 4 kids in one classroom with behavior problems, you're like that guy who's running around spinning plates on a pole. You're trying to keep track of it all. And I think the consistency is the hardest part about that. But they can be immensely successful, especially if they're consistent. Anything else? Thank you. Anything else about developmental? Anyone want to add anything? Okay. Interpersonal or social. Anyone? Yes.
Included a student who he doesn't stop talking ever.
He talks in his sleep too?
I don't know, but I would think so. But we're thinking that the issue may be that he's recently lost more hearing, so now he's in the deaf and hard of hearing classroom. He doesn't have a strong base in sign, so when we're in a group, I'm thinking that he is controlling the conversation because then he always knows what's going on. So we were talking about, doing some repair strategies for communication breakdown, getting some other ways that he could maybe solve that problem if there's a communication breakdown without trying to constantly control, because then it causes problems with other kids who are relying on maybe their hearing too, and I'm talking and signing, and he's talking at the same time. And also maybe working with a social worker to maybe deal with some of the emotional issues of, his hearing decreasing and so then dealing now with the fact that I can't do the things I used to do out mainstream because I can't, I'm not fluent in sign yet and I can't hear what's going on. So I think there's a lot of things going on, but I think it's sort of a control issue of trying to control the conversation that's going on. The disadvantages, I guess, would be that, you might want to find someone maybe that has experienced the same thing he has, even though it's in his family that other people have. But other than that, advantages would be, pretty clear that, other kids can learn, the teachers wouldn't be going crazy. And then I think when we come up with a plan, the only other thing would be is that he does switch teachers and go out to the nature of it, so he some kind of making sure everyone's on the same page and is following kind of the same plan to help him, pass all of the talking out and trying to control the situation.
Fantastic. I really like the way that you're looking at a particular behavior from that developmental perspective, because kids, school-age kids, they're dealing from an Ericksonian perspective. They're dealing with what? They're dealing with fitting in, right? And they start separating from their parents the older they get, and they start trying to connect with the peer group. And being different is the worst thing that can happen to you, right? Because then different sets you up to be picked on. And so developmentally, if we're looking at the Ericksonian stages of development for kids, we can guess that there's a lot of angst in childhood, a lot of angst and potential for that. And so if you have a deaf child who's in a mainstream program, that kid's going to completely stick out like a sore thumb. I saw the opposite, which is kind of interesting. I'll share with you, at Gallaudet, at the Model Secondary School for the Deaf, where I was working at as well, we would have kids who came from mainstream programs, who had cochlear implants, and they were stepping into an all-deaf environment, and suddenly they're sticking out again.
Who's coming in from being hearing, now coming into the deaf and hard of hearing program. So I don't think he fits. He doesn't fit anywhere because he doesn't have the sign base, but he can't hear out in the mainstream, so translating his rights.
Right. So never underestimate the power of being on the outside looking in on behavior. That's really potent. I think it's often overlooked. If you go back through and start looking at those Ericksonian stages of development and throw your kid up against that, you could say, oh my God, that's what's going on. It makes so much sense. Oftentimes. Not all the time, but oftentimes. Thank you. Anything else on developmental? Yes?
I have a quick thought. So especially if you're working with kids, Because sometimes, like, the treatment, which would be, especially with a child with social problems, social skills,
Right.
in treating them to get them to interact with other kids, that in a way can have them stick out like a sore thumb.
Yes.
Because then other kids would realize, oh, they're making me talk to Timmy because he's got problems. Yeah, so it's kind of a weird situation because even though they're trying to treat Timmy to interact with someone else, maybe someone else would be, because kids are cruel, let's just face it sometimes, and they can be, well, yeah, I'll talk to him, but how am I looked at now by these other kids for having to interact? Because they don't understand in the terms of, there's nothing wrong with Timmy, it's just this little issue.
And the risks of associating with somebody who's on the outside. You can possibly lose status, other kids can look at you funny, and then the whole self-esteem piece of it comes into play. I remember a kid that I worked with, it was a hearing program. The kid had a glass eye, and he had a lot of behavioral issues, and he was a poster child for Adderall, I guess. He would literally jump on the tables and run across desks and stuff like that. It was quite difficult to control him. But one of the things that he would do is that he'd pop his glass eye out. He would do it regularly to freak the other kids out. Okay, so... And so, you want to address that from... There it goes. The glass eye's bouncing on the table. So he would do this, and it would gross the other kids out. Okay, as you can well imagine, because then he'd show them the socket, It was nasty, right? It was nasty. And so I kept trying to figure out what was going on. Why was he doing this? Well, it became clear to me that it was a sabotaging behavior. That he was developmentally at that stage, he was 12, where he's starting to try and fit in with the peer group. And they would never accept somebody who was different. And he knew he was different. So he went to the opposite extreme. He's like, I'll give them a reason to dislike me. And so he would throw it right up into their face. When I started looking at it from that perspective, I was like, wow. And so when we tried to have somebody befriend the kid, they're like, not me. Not me. It doesn't work for everybody. Yeah, thank you. Okay, social interpersonal? Anybody? Did we do that already? Thank you. Yes?
We did interpersonal. We were looking at it more from a language point of view. And we said that not understanding their classmates, whether it's socializing, cooperative or collaborative projects, not understanding the language necessarily that the teacher's using, idioms, expressions, etc., can lead to a lot of these behaviors just because they're not sure what it is that we're asking them to do, how we're asking them to interact with their classmates. And so we said not hearing and understanding teacher directions, misunderstanding humor, figurative language, and limited interactions or experiences at home. And so we said for interventions, role-playing, modeling interactions, ensuring the child understands the terms, vocabulary, and language of what we're doing, setting up scenarios like what would you do if, or giving examples of cooperative playing, including sharing and turn-taking, modeling and giving them the language, making sure that they're all on the same level in participating.
Fantastic. And prompting, prompting them, what is it that you're supposed to do at this time period? When this happens, what are you supposed to do? Fantastic approach. Never underestimate, I keep saying, never underestimate the power of not fitting in. When you don't fit in, it can be immensely powerful. And if there's a lot of peer pressure or group think that's going on in your classroom, it could be very difficult. Okay, so interpersonal here, I just want to active resistance here. How many of your deaf children shut their eyes when they don't want to hear what you're saying? Yeah? Yeah, of course, right? The number one frustrating thing when you're an educator with deaf kids. Because, the other kids can go, la, 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 I don't hear you, I don't hear you. But the deaf kids just do this. And what are you going to do? Open their eyes? Open them, open them, open them. It becomes a power struggle, right? So in that situation, you're really kind of stuck, right? You can't put your hands on the kid and open their eyes. But when you think about the social piece of that, what are they getting when they shut their eyes? Or immediate attention, right? They're getting the teacher's immediate attention. Open it, tap on the shoulder, open it, and suddenly the whole classroom is focused in on that one kid. Okay, thank you. Physiological, biological. Anyone? I saw somebody in the back was working on this. No? Yes? I ratted you out, didn't I?
Actually he falls under every category because it's so severe. He has a personal development, so he's at kindergarten level, emotionally, he's probably somewhere grade school, he's in high school, and cognitive. The approach has been, first off, medical. He's on medication. There's a problem with his swearing and everything up papers. They did an FBA on him. And the approach was that he doesn't want to get frustrated, so we give him a break. Problem is that I went in observing frustration, it's excitement, he doesn't know what to say, so he could be out of the room most of the day. So we're just dealing with all the disciplines because it is every level. And for the teacher, we're looking at the behavioral momentum part of it for the frustration. Sometimes giving the things that he just doesn't get. For social, we're doing role play. One of the things we need is he's going to swear. No matter what emotion he has that's a little bit exciting or a little bit upsetting, to teach him a script to say instead. But it's going to take a lot of work. It's like a golfer ready to change his swing, right? So we got the speech therapist involved for scripting, something that we could do. The aids for prompting, some of the things that we wanted to do. But if they would have just kept going with their approach, which was give him a break, it has not decreased the swearing in the paper really. And hopefully some of these things, the advantage to these is that we will see a decrease in that. We've been working with the teacher and the aide for behavioral momentum, and it has decreased it by almost 3/4.
Wow. That's a good success story.
That quarter is, we've got to teach him a different script. What are you willing to put up with? And what would be an appropriate thing for him to say?
So when you're dealing with thank you very much. When you're dealing with a medical etiology for behavior, it can be really difficult for you, and you can be struggling trying to find the right approach. Sometimes medication can work, sometimes it can't. But we tend to, remember, I don't know if you've ever heard the expression, if you tend to treat every problem as if it's a nail, if the only tool you have at your disposal is a hammer, you tend to treat every problem as if it were a nail. The problem with operating from one of these perspectives only is that you're only treating that part of it. And so what I like about your approach back there is that you cover all of these. You're going from a very pluralistic, holistic kind of approach in trying to address it. Thanks. Okay. Any last questions before we move on? Okay. So, has anyone ever seen this before? Yes. Okay. Now, how many of you see her spinning clockwise? Please raise your hand. How many of you see her spinning counterclockwise? Please raise your hand. Can you make her switch? She did? No. Okay, so this is a bistable precept. It's a fixed point of view that we can then take different perspectives for. And it's pretty cool, right? When I use this in workshops, I always tell parents, this is the point where I'm hypnotizing you. Make the check payable to Matthew Ryder. Okay? Because they just get fascinated with it. Anybody not make her switch? You'll have to trust me, she switches, okay? It has something to do with your perspective. When you shift your perspective, then she moves the other direction. I see heads tilting this way. I mean perspective in here. It's Cute. Okay. All right. She just moved. Let's celebrate success, right? Woo-hoo. Okay. So what is the point of this? The point of this is not so that you guys can get lulled into a nice, safe feeling, or, well, it is kind of. But the point of this is to say that if you look at behavior from one perspective all the time, you're going to respond to that behavior as if it's from that perspective. But if you can change your perspective just a little bit, you'll respond to that behavior differently. And so I love this because it allows me to constantly say, is what's happening the only thing that's happening? Or is there something else going on? And when I start looking at problems differently, from a different perspective, holding it up to those 5 different areas, then I start saying, okay, is it this, 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 or this? Instead of just assuming it's this, then I can make better decisions about it. If anyone wants this later, I'll be happy to email it to you. Okay? So what exactly is a paradox? A paradox is a statement or of some type that is counterintuitive. It goes against what you would think, okay? So it's a statement or concept that contains conflicting ideas, but in the end it's actually true. Some simple garden variety ones are less is more. How can less be more? Less, by definition, is less than. It can't be more than. But as my Italian neighbor had once told me, she said, a little bit of pepper tastes good. A lot of pepper is not so good. So less is more. So any of these statements, when you look at them, seem to be counterintuitive. So a paradox, and we use a sign, I taught the interpreters, I asked several other deaf friends of mine for a good sign for it, and the best one that I can come up with is this. So it's kind of the reverse of what you would expect. So the thing that I like about paradoxical approaches, and I'm going to go back 2 slides, is that it covers 4 of these. When you take a paradoxical approach, you can approach it from the cognitive piece of it, by addressing the cognition, the script, and changing the script, and engaging the rational brain. The emotional piece of it by addressing the self-esteem and the emotional angst that's going on. The developmental, because you can target kids and being able to get them to eventually make better decisions, which is what our goal is. And the interpersonal, because you're modeling behavior. So I love paradoxical approaches. They're tricky though, because if you don't know what you're doing with a paradoxical approach, you can set yourself up for a big backfire. And I've had them before. I know you guys want to stare at the dancing lady. Okay, so let's talk about resistance from a paradoxical perspective, okay? Resistance in and of itself, resistance behavior is episodic, and it's seldom personal. So it means that, how many of you have ever had a kid, and when you got the kid, you got the file before the kid, and it said, this kid has behavior problems? Yes. So immediately you knew that you were dealing with a problem kid, right? Yes? But in reality, and somebody over here said something that student talks all the time. Who was that I picked on? Okay. You mentioned that your student talks all the time, right? And I said, what did I say? Does he talk in his sleep? Because we use these words, these all-inclusive words such as all the time and constantly to exaggerate our own frustration with stuff. When in reality, resistant behavior is not something that happens all the time. It's pretty low frequency. They kind of just do the bare minimum, but when they act out, whew, it's intense, it gets the whole classroom involved or everyone involved, it's exhausting, and then they come back down from it and they can go another couple of weeks without an incident. Sometimes it's every day, but it's not all day, every day. It's not constantly. There are lots of times when he or she may not actually be resisting behavior, okay, or showing resistant behavior. So resistance is also very much